When the first season of Blue Locked came out, there were episodes where finishing the episode almost felt inconvenient because all I wanted to do was go outside and play football. I don't think many anime have ever given me that exact feeling, where watching someone improve suddenly makes you uncomfortable with standing still yourself. And I know I wasn't the only one. If you already loved football, Blue Lock had this strange ability to make normal matches with your friends feel a little more serious the next time you stepped onto the pitch. Because suddenly you were thinking about things like positioning, confidence, and what you could actually do better, instead of simply chasing the ball. That was probably the biggest reason it connected with me. I wasn't watching it as someone trying to become a professional striker, and I definitely wasn't about to start screaming about devouring my teammates. But underneath all of the ridiculous Blue Lock language were ideas that felt surprisingly familiar if you've ever cared about becoming better at football. The character who affected the way I thought the most was Isagi. He wasn't the strongest player or the fastest one, and especially at the beginning, there wasn't an obvious physical ability that made him special. So his answer was to keep looking at what was happening around him and change himself accordingly. That part stayed with me much more than any individual goal. After playing badly, instead of only thinking that I had a bad game, I started paying more attention to why certain things weren't working, what other players were doing differently, and what I could change the next time I played. Blue Lock exaggerates almost everything about football. But that idea doesn't really need exaggeration. Sometimes you improve because you finally stop protecting the version of yourself that you're already comfortable with. One of the first ideas in Blue Lock that really grabbed me was the concept of going back to zero. When something about your game clearly isn't working anymore, continuing to force it just because it's familiar can become its own kind of weakness. That's uncomfortable in actual football because everybody develops habits. You find positions you like, movements you trust, and situations where you feel useful. And after a while, those things can quietly become rules that you don't even realize you're following. Watching Isagi constantly lose whatever certainty he had and rebuild from there made me think differently about that. A bad performance doesn't always mean you need to try the exact same thing harder. Sometimes the useful part is figuring out what the match exposed about you. I've had games where something I normally rely on simply wasn't there. Maybe I couldn't get into the spaces I wanted. Maybe another player was reading me too easily. Or maybe I was trying to play the way I imagined the game instead of reacting to the game that was actually happening. Blue Lock gives that process dramatic names and turns every realization into a battle. But the feeling underneath it is real. You can walk onto the pitch convinced you know what kind of player you are and leave realizing that you need another answer. That doesn't mean throwing away everything you're good at. It means being willing to rebuild parts of your game before somebody else forces you to realize they've stopped working. Then Blue Lock introduced the idea of a weapon, and that was probably one of the easiest concepts to carry over into real football. Not everybody needs to be good at everything, but you should eventually understand what you can do that makes people want you on their team. The interesting part is that your weapon doesn't have to look impressive. It could be speed like Chigiri, something obvious and almost impossible to ignore. But it can also be positioning, timing, protecting the ball, finding a pass quickly, or simply noticing space before somebody else does. That made me start paying more attention to my own matches, instead of only judging myself by whether I scored or whether we won. I started noticing which situations consistently made me useful and which parts of my game disappeared the moment the match became uncomfortable. There's also something motivating about seeing Blue Lock trait improvement, like discovering pieces of yourself, rather than receiving some completely new ability. A lot of the characters already have talent when they arrive, The challenge is understanding exactly how that talent becomes dangerous. Nagi is probably the clearest example. His control is absurd almost immediately, but having an incredible touch isn't automatically the same thing as knowing what kind of player you want to become, and watching him slowly develop that hunger is part of what makes him so interesting. The concept made me appreciate specialization more. You can spend forever worrying about everything another player does better than you, or you can become much more aware of the situations where you can force the game to come toward your strengths. Another reason Blue Lock works so well for football players is that eventually you start recognizing people you've played with inside these characters. Obviously, nobody at your local pitch is performing anime techniques, but the personalities are familiar enough that sometimes the comparison happens immediately. There is always somebody who feels a little like Chigiri, the player whose speed changes the entire shape of a play once he gets space. You don't need anyone to explain his weapon, because the moment he starts running, everybody on the other team reacts to it. Then you have players like Baru, who are almost more interesting because of the personality attached to their ability. Every football group has met somebody who absolutely believes the attack should go through him, and when that confidence matches the skill, it can be both incredibly useful and incredibly annoying. Kunigami feels familiar in a different way. He plays with a directness that makes sense immediately. And before Blue Lock starts twisting everyone into more extreme versions of themselves, there is something almost reassuring about a player who knows what he wants to do and attacks the game honestly. And then there is Nagi, the type of player who can make something difficult look so effortless that everybody else gets irritated. Anyone who has played football long enough has probably met somebody who seems naturally gifted in a way that doesn't feel fair, especially when they don't even appear to care as much as everyone around them. Those characters made Blue Lock feel less like a collection of football superpowers to me. Beneath all the exaggeration, I could still recognize different kinds of players and occasionally uncomfortable pieces of myself. The part of Isagi's development that interested me most wasn't that he kept becoming stronger. It was how quickly he became willing to abandon an idea of himself once the game proved that it wasn't enough. Early Isagi hesitates constantly. He sees possibilities, but there is still a delay between understanding what he should do and actually having the confidence to impose himself on the match, which is probably one of the most relatable problems a football player can have. Then that hesitation gradually disappears. He starts treating every match almost like information, watching how people move, figuring out what creates a goal, and using whatever he learns without worrying too much about whether it fits the player he was supposed to be before. That mindset affected me, because adaptation sounds simple until you're actually playing. It's much easier to notice after a match that something went wrong than it is to recognize it while you're tired, frustrated, and still expected to make the next decision correctly. Isagi keeps trying to solve that problem in real time. If another player has something he doesn't understand, he studies it. If his current approach stops producing chances, he searches for another one instead of waiting for the match to magically become comfortable again. There is something slightly ruthless about that version of improvement, and I think that's why it stuck with me. He doesn't treat his current style like an identity that needs to be protected. He treats it like a draft. Ego is obviously the idea Blue Lock pushes harder than almost anything else, and it's also the one that becomes easiest to misunderstand outside the anime. Being selfish with the ball every time you touch it isn't suddenly good football because Jinpachi Ego gave a speech about strikers. The version of ego that actually made sense to me was closer to conviction. There are moments in football where you need to believe that you should take the shot, make the run, or demand the ball, because hesitating for 1 second can remove the opportunity completely. I've definitely had moments where being too passive hurt more than making the wrong decision would have. You see something opening in front of you, but instead of trusting yourself, you look for the safer option. And by the time you've decided what you really wanted to do, the play is gone. Blue lock turns that feeling into something enormous. But I understand why. Football can punish insecurity very quickly, especially in attacking positions where you don't get unlimited chances to decide whether you belong in the moment. Flow was another concept that immediately felt recognizable. There are matches where you're thinking about everything and nothing works. And then there are matches where decisions seem to happen slightly before you're consciously aware of making them. You stop calculating every touch. The pace of the match feels right. You're reacting naturally. And for a while, your ability and the difficulty in front of you seem perfectly matched. That's one of those ideas Blue Lock didn't really need to convince me of, because I'd already felt a smaller version of it. The anime simply gave that feeling a name and made me pay more attention to when it happens. By the time Blue Lock reaches players like Shido in the U20 match, the series has moved far beyond anything I could realistically compare with the football at play. And strangely, I don't think that weakens the personal side of it. Shido feels almost like the endpoint of the striker obsession Blue Lock has been building from the beginning. He doesn't need football to become comfortable or predictable. He seems happiest when a situation becomes chaotic enough that he can invent an answer nobody else would attempt. Watching players at that level also changes what Isagi's adaptability means. Earlier, he is trying to survive among people with obvious weapons, while later, he has to process increasingly ridiculous players and still find some way to make himself relevant inside the same match. The U20 game is where that progression really paid off for me. Blue Lock stops feeling like a strange, isolated experiment and suddenly has to prove that everything these players have been developing can survive against an actual organized team with something to lose. And even with all the exaggerated abilities, that was probably when the original appeal came back strongest. I wasn't watching because I thought any of this was a realistic coaching manual. I was watching players desperately trying to find one more thing inside themselves when the level around them kept rising. That's the feeling I remember most from Blue Lock. Not that it taught me some secret formula for football, and not that I suddenly started playing like Isagi after watching it. It made me leave episodes thinking about my own game. And more than anything, it made me want to play.